The neighbors stopped laughing when the blizzard hit on February 9th, 1888, and Helena Marsh's children were the only ones still alive 3 weeks later. What the widow had built beneath her cabin floor while the community mocked her would become the difference between survival and freezing to death in the worst storm Dakota Territory had ever seen. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of survival and maternal strength move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story will leave you speechless. Helena Marsh knelt on the wooden floor of her cabin, measuring the space between the support beams with a length of twine she had marked in 6-inch intervals. Her daughter Anna, 8 years old, sat at the table practicing her letters. Her son Thomas, 6, played with wooden blocks near the fireplace. Neither child paid much attention to what their mother was doing. They had grown accustomed to her strange projects over the past year, ever since their father had died. Outside, 3 women from neighboring homesteads stood in a cluster near Helena's well, their voices carrying through the thin walls. They thought they were speaking quietly, but sound traveled easily across the flat Dakota prairie, especially on calm autumn days like this one in 1887. "She's measuring again," Margaret Thornton said, her tone mixing concern with judgment. "I saw her at the general store last week buying mining tools. Mining tools. What does a widow with 2 children need with a pickaxe and a shovel meant for breaking rock?" "Jacob's death affected her more than we realized," Sarah Coleman replied. "Grief does strange things to people. My cousin back in Pennsylvania, after she lost her husband, she convinced herself their house was sinking into the ground. Spent 6 months trying to jack it up with timbers." "This is different," the third woman, Ruth Anders, said firmly. "Helena's not acting confused. She's acting deliberate. She's planning something, and whatever it is, it's going to cost her what little money Jacob left behind. Those children need food and warm clothes for winter, not whatever foolishness she's concocting." Helena heard every word. She had learned to recognize the particular quality of voices that meant people were talking about her. It had been happening for months now, ever since she had started asking questions around town about excavation techniques, about how miners reinforced underground tunnels, about how root cellars were constructed to prevent cave-ins. The questions had seemed innocent enough at first, but as the summer progressed and people saw her purchasing increasingly unusual supplies, the speculation had grown. She continued her measurements, marking the floor with small pencil dots that would be invisible unless you knew to look for them. The space she had identified was perfect. 8 feet by 10 feet, positioned between the main support beams that held up the cabin. Large enough for what she needed. Small enough that the excavation would not compromise the structural integrity of the building above. Anna looked up from her writing. "Mama, why are you drawing on the floor?" "Just planning, sweetheart," Helena said softly. "Go back to your letters." Thomas abandoned his blocks and came over to investigate. He crouched down next to his mother, his small face serious. "Are you building something?" "Yes," Helena said simply. "What?" "Something to keep us safe." The boy considered this for a moment, then nodded and returned to his blocks. At 6 years old, he accepted his mother's explanations without requiring additional detail. Anna, older and more perceptive, watched her mother for a few seconds longer before returning to her paper. Outside, the women's conversation continued. Helena caught fragments of it as they moved away from the well toward the road. Words like unstable and wasting resources and someone should talk to her drifted through the afternoon air. Helena ignored them. She had stopped caring what the neighbors thought sometime around July, when she had finally committed to the plan that had been forming in her mind since the previous winter. Let them talk. Let them speculate. Let them think she was mad with grief or foolish with her late husband's small inheritance. When the time came, when the crisis she knew was inevitable finally arrived, none of their opinions would matter. Only preparation would matter. Only having built what needed to be built would make the difference. She finished her measurements and sat back on her heels, studying the marked floor. Tomorrow she would begin the real work. Tomorrow she would start digging. The morning Jacob Marsh died, the sky had been the color of old pewter, heavy and low and promising snow. It was October 14th, 1886, 18 months before Helena would kneel on her cabin floor, taking measurements that would confuse her neighbors. Jacob had gone out at dawn to check on their small herd of cattle, 6 animals that represented a significant portion of their wealth and their ability to survive the coming winter. Helena had been kneading bread dough when he left. She remembered the way he had kissed her forehead and ruffled Thomas's hair as the boy sat eating porridge at the table. Anna had still been asleep in the loft. Jacob had pulled on his heavy coat, the one lined with wool that Helena had spent 2 months sewing the previous year, and he had said what he always said when he left the cabin for any reason. Back before you know it. The snow had started an hour after he left. Not the gentle, picturesque snow that drifted down on calm winter days, but the aggressive, wind-driven snow that came at you horizontally, that filled the air so completely you could not see your own hand extended at arm's length. Helena had not been particularly worried at first. Jacob knew the land. He had survived 4 Dakota winters. He would find shelter with the cattle or make his way back to the cabin. The distance was not great, perhaps a 1/4 mile to where they kept the animals in a rough shelter near a creek bed. By midday, when he had not returned, Helena's concern had grown. By evening, it had transformed into fear. She had stood at the window, staring out into the white chaos, unable to see anything beyond the glass except the accumulated snow on the sill. Thomas had asked where Papa was. Anna, awake by then and old enough to sense her mother's anxiety, had taken her brother to the loft and distracted him with stories. Helena had stayed at the window until the light failed completely. Then she had sat in a chair near the door, wrapped in blankets, waiting. The wind had screamed around the cabin all night. The temperature inside had dropped steadily, despite the fire she kept burning. Several times she had considered going out to search for Jacob, but she knew it would be suicide. She would become lost within yards of the cabin door. She would freeze before she found anything. The children would wake to find both parents gone. So she had waited. And in the waiting, something in her mind had begun the process that would eventually lead to the measurements she would take 18 months later, to the project the neighbors would mock, to the room beneath the floor that would save her children's lives. Dawn had come slowly, the wind dropping, the snow thinning to scattered flakes. Helena had dressed in every warm garment she owned and gone out searching. She had found Jacob 200 yards from the cabin, closer than she had expected, farther than he should have been. He had been trying to come home. He had gotten disoriented in the whiteout. He had frozen to death within shouting distance of safety. The cattle had survived. They had huddled together in their shelter and endured the storm without difficulty. The animals had been fine. Her husband had died. Helena had gotten help from neighbors to bring Jacob's body back to the cabin. The funeral had been simple, attended by the scattered community of homesteaders who lived within 5 miles. People had said kind things about Jacob. They had brought food. They had offered help with the children. Then they had returned to their own lives and their own preparations for winter. Helena had returned to her cabin and realized something that would not leave her alone. The storm that killed Jacob had not been particularly unusual for Dakota Territory. It had been severe but not unprecedented. Similar storms happened every winter, sometimes multiple times. And when those storms came, families had no choice but to remain in their cabins and hope the structures held, hope the supplies lasted, hope the cold did not penetrate walls that were often hastily built and poorly insulated. Jacob had died because he had been caught outside, but families died inside their cabins too. Helena knew the stories. Everyone did. The family 3 miles south, whose cabin roof had collapsed under snow weight 2 winters ago, killing the father and 1 child. The couple 10 miles east, who had run out of firewood during an extended storm and frozen to death in their own home. The children found in spring when the snows melted, in cabins their parents had thought would protect them. Cabins were not enough. Not when the real storms came. Not when disasters lasted longer than anyone expected. Helena had understood this with absolute clarity in the weeks after Jacob's death, and once she understood it, she could not stop thinking about solutions. The winter after Jacob's death was the longest of Helena's life, not because of the cold or the isolation, but because of the relentless working of her mind. She could not stop analyzing every aspect of their survival situation. Every time the wind picked up, she evaluated the cabin's weaknesses. Every time she rationed their food supplies, she calculated how long they could last if a storm prevented her from reaching the general store in town. Every time she added wood to the fire, she assessed their remaining fuel and wondered what would happen if they ran out. Anna and Thomas noticed the change in their mother, though they could not articulate what was different. Helena had always been attentive, but now her attention had a quality of constant assessment. She studied the cabin's construction with an intensity that made the children uneasy. She spent hours staring at the walls, the floor, the ceiling, as if trying to see through the wood to some hidden truth beneath. In January of 1887, 3 months after Jacob's death, Helena began visiting other homesteads under the pretense of social calls. She brought small gifts, preserves she had put up the previous summer, bread she had baked. The women welcomed her visits. They understood that a widow needed connection with other women, needed to maintain social bonds that would support her through grief and the practical challenges of managing a homestead alone. But Helena's true purpose had nothing to do with companionship. She was studying how other families prepared for winter. She was documenting, in her mind, the failures she observed. The Hendersons had a cabin with gaps between the logs wide enough to see daylight through. The Mitchells stored all their food supplies in a lean-to attached to the main cabin, vulnerable to animal intrusion and temperature fluctuations. The Carlsons had only 2 weeks of firewood stacked, relying on the assumption that mild weather would allow them to gather more as needed. Helena saw patterns of dangerous optimism everywhere. Families assumed storms would be brief. They assumed they would have access to towns and neighbors during emergencies. They assumed their cabins, built quickly and economically, would be adequate. These assumptions were usually correct, which reinforced the behavior. But occasionally, perhaps once every few years, the assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. She began reading everything she could find about disasters and survival. The general store in town carried newspapers from larger cities, sometimes months old by the time they arrived on the frontier. Helena read accounts of mine disasters where men survived underground for days. She read about ship crews who endured weeks in lifeboats. She read about families in mountain regions who prepared elaborate root cellars that kept them fed through seasons of isolation. One article in particular captured her attention. It described a family in Vermont who had survived an avalanche that buried their farmhouse under 20 feet of snow. They had lived for 11 days in a space beneath their kitchen, accessing supplies they had stored in a cellar, breathing through a ventilation pipe that happened to extend above the snow line. The article had been written as a human interest story, focusing on the miraculous nature of their survival. Helena read it as a technical manual. The principle was clear. Vertical space beneath the living area, could provide protection that horizontal space could not. A cabin might collapse or become inaccessible, but a properly constructed underground room could remain intact and habitable. If that room contained adequate supplies and proper ventilation, it could sustain life for extended periods. Helena began asking questions at the general store, at church, at any gathering where she might encounter men with construction or mining experience. She framed her inquiries carefully, making them seem casual rather than purposeful. She asked miners how they prevented tunnel collapses. She asked farmers how they kept root cellars dry. She asked the blacksmith about the strength of different metals for reinforcing structures. People answered her questions because she was a widow and they wanted to be helpful, but they found her curiosity odd. Women on the frontier needed to know how to preserve food, mend clothes, manage livestock, and maintain households. They did not typically need to know about excavation techniques or structural engineering. The questions marked Helena as unusual, but her recent loss provided an explanation. Grief made people behave strangely. Everyone knew that. By March of 1887, Helena had developed a comprehensive plan. She knew what she needed to build, how to build it, and why it was necessary. The only remaining questions were practical ones. Could she afford the materials? Could she do the physical work alone? Could she complete the project before the next winter arrived? And most importantly, could she do it all while maintaining the appearance of normal widowhood without drawing so much attention that neighbors would interfere or try to stop her? She decided the answers were yes, 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 and yes. In April, when the ground thawed enough to permit digging, she would begin. She would build what needed to be built, and she would do it regardless of what anyone thought or said. The obsession that had formed in the wake of Jacob's death had crystallized into absolute determination. Helena Marsh was going to create a survival space that could keep her children alive no matter what disaster came. She was going to dig beneath her cabin floor and construct a room that could function as a refuge when the world above became uninhabitable. She was going to do this with her own hands, her own money, and her own will. And if people called her crazy, if they mocked her, if they thought grief had unbalanced her mind, she did not care. She had watched her husband freeze to death 200 yards from safety. She had understood, in that moment of discovery, that conventional preparations were inadequate. Now she was going to do something unconventional. She was going to ensure that her children would not die the way their father had, caught unprepared when nature turned hostile. The obsession was complete. The planning was finished. Spring was coming. The work would begin. Helena's plan existed entirely in her mind until May of 1887, when she finally committed it to paper. She sat at her table one evening after the children had gone to sleep in the loft and drew diagrams by candlelight. The drawings were crude but functional, showing dimensions and structural elements with careful precision. The underground room would measure 8 feet by 10 feet, giving her 80 square feet of floor space. She had calculated that this was the minimum area needed to store adequate supplies and provide cramped but survivable living space for 3 people. The depth would be 7 feet, tall enough that she could stand upright, deep enough that the earthen walls would provide insulation and protection. The entrance would be the most critical design element. Helena planned a trapdoor set flush with the cabin floor, positioned between 2 existing support beams. The door itself would need to be strong enough to support furniture and foot traffic from above, yet light enough that she could lift it when necessary. She would construct it from planks tongue and grooved together, reinforced with cross braces on the underside. Iron hinges, the heaviest she could obtain, would be mortised into both the door and the floor frame. The entire assembly would be concealed beneath a small rug and strategically placed furniture, making it invisible to casual observation. Access would require a sturdy ladder. Helena designed a simple but robust version, anchored to the underground room's floor with iron brackets set in stone. The ladder would be fixed in place, not removable, ensuring it could not shift or collapse under weight. Ventilation presented a complex challenge. People could survive for weeks without food, days without water, but only minutes without air. An underground room with no air circulation would become a tomb rather than a refuge. Helena's solution drew from her conversations with miners and her reading about sealed spaces. She would construct a vertical shaft running from the underground room up through the cabin floor, disguised as a structural support post. The shaft would be 4 inches square internally, large enough to permit airflow, small enough to avoid compromising structural integrity. At the top, concealed within the hollow post, a series of small holes drilled at angles would allow air exchange while preventing rain or snow from entering directly. The mathematics of survival dominated Helena's planning. 3 people required approximately 1 gallon of water per person per day for drinking and minimal washing. For a 30-day supply, she needed 90 gallons. Water weighed approximately 8 pounds per gallon, meaning 720 pounds of water weight. She would need barrels, at least 3 of them, positioned carefully to distribute the weight across the underground room's floor. Food calculations were equally precise. Preserved foods that would not spoil without refrigeration, that required no cooking or minimal preparation, that provided adequate nutrition for extended periods. Salted meat, dried beans, flour, hardtack, dried fruit, canned vegetables if she could afford them. She estimated 3 pounds of food per person per day, accounting for high-calorie needs in cold conditions. For 30 days, she needed 270 pounds of food, plus containers and storage arrangements that would keep everything dry and protected from vermin. Heat and light created additional requirements. Even underground, temperatures in Dakota Territory winters could fall below freezing. The room would need insulation and a heat source. Helena planned to store firewood, though burning it underground presented obvious dangers with smoke and carbon monoxide. As an alternative, she would keep wool blankets, multiple layers, and possibly a small alcohol lamp that burned cleanly and could provide both heat and light without producing dangerous smoke. The structural engineering challenged Helena's limited knowledge. She needed walls that would not collapse under the pressure of surrounding earth. She needed a ceiling that could support the cabin floor and everything on it without sagging or failing. She needed waterproofing that would prevent the room from flooding during spring thaws or heavy rains. Her solution combined several techniques she had learned about through her research. The walls would be timber framed, using thick posts set vertically every 2 feet around the perimeter. Between the posts, she would pack stones, creating a double layer of support: timber for structural strength, stone for pressure distribution. Behind the stone, she would leave a small air gap, then pack more earth, creating a buffer zone that would help manage moisture and provide additional insulation. The ceiling would be heavy timber beams, the same type used in mine tunnels, laid across the top of the room and extending to rest on the undisturbed earth beyond the excavation. Above the beams, she would lay planking, then a layer of tar paper for waterproofing, then the cabin's original floor structure, reinforced where necessary. The floor of the underground room would be stone, set in packed earth, sloped slightly toward one corner where she would install a small drain that led to a dry well outside the cabin's foundation. This would handle any water that seeped in, preventing standing water that could cause mold or structural problems. Helena estimated the project would require approximately 60 hours of excavation work, assuming she could dig and remove roughly 1 cubic yard of earth per hour. The carpentry, waterproofing, and finishing work would take another 40 hours. The entire project, working alone during daylight hours when the children were occupied or visiting neighbors, would take approximately 3 months if she worked steadily. The cost concerned her more than the labor. Jacob had left her with $800 in savings, a substantial sum by frontier standards, representing years of careful economy. The materials she needed, particularly the heavy timbers, iron hardware, and waterproofing materials, would consume perhaps $200. The remaining $600 would need to support her family for at least a year, probably longer. It was a dangerous allocation of resources, risking a quarter of their financial security on a project most people would consider insane. But Helena had moved beyond conventional risk assessment. She was not balancing probabilities anymore. She was preparing for a specific type of catastrophe that she knew, with absolute certainty, would eventually occur. Not if, but when. And when it came, money in a bank would be worthless. Food stores in a collapsed cabin would be inaccessible. Conventional preparations would fail. Only her unconventional solution would save them. She folded her diagrams and hid them inside a book on the shelf. Tomorrow she would begin purchasing materials, spreading the purchases across multiple trips to town, buying from different merchants when possible, creating no obvious pattern that would draw attention. She would tell people she was doing repairs on the cabin, reinforcing the foundation, improving the structure. All of it would be technically true, if incomplete. The underground vision was complete. Now came the work of making it real. The first shovelful of dirt came up on May 17th, 1887, a Tuesday morning when the sun had barely cleared the eastern horizon. Helena had sent the children to stay with Sarah Coleman for 3 days, telling her neighbor that she needed time alone to sort through Jacob's belongings and make decisions about which items to keep and which to sell. Sarah had accepted this explanation without question. Everyone understood that grief required solitary time, that a widow needed privacy to process her loss and organize her future. The moment the children disappeared down the road toward the Coleman homestead, Helena moved the furniture aside, rolled up the small rug that marked her workspace, and began prying up the floorboards she had carefully loosened over the previous week. The boards came up easily, revealing the packed earth beneath. She had marked the perimeter of her excavation with small stakes driven into the ground, invisible when the floor was in place, perfectly positioned to guide her work. She started digging in the northwest corner, working systematically, removing earth in layers approximately 6 inches deep. The soil was dense clay mixed with rocks, harder to penetrate than she had hoped, but also more stable than loose sandy soil would have been. Each shovelful required significant effort. She drove the blade in with her foot, leveraged the handle, lifted the loaded shovel, and carried the dirt to a bucket positioned nearby. The physical reality of the project announced itself immediately. Helena was 31 years old, strong from years of farm work, but digging was different from any labor she had done before. The repetitive motion engaged muscles in her back, shoulders, and legs that were unaccustomed to this particular stress. Within an hour, her hands had developed blisters where the shovel handle rubbed. Within 2 hours, her lower back ached with a deep, persistent pain that intensified with each shovelful. She worked through the pain. There was no alternative. The project had a timeline, and that timeline was non-negotiable. She needed to complete the excavation, construction, and provisioning before winter arrived. That gave her approximately 6 months, and at least 3 of those months would be consumed by the actual building work and supply gathering. The digging needed to happen as quickly as possible. By midday, she had excavated approximately 1 cubic foot of earth. The calculation was devastating. Her underground room required digging out roughly 390 cubic feet of soil. At her current rate, the excavation alone would take more than a year. The timeline was impossible. The project was failing before it had truly begun. Helena climbed out of the shallow depression she had created and sat on the cabin floor, her muscles trembling with exhaustion, her hands bleeding through the burst blisters. She allowed herself 5 minutes of despair, acknowledging the enormous gap between her planning and the physical reality of execution. Then she began problem solving. The issue was efficiency. She was treating each shovelful as a separate action, digging, lifting, carrying, dumping, returning, digging again. The motion was inefficient, and the distance to her dump site, outside the cabin where she was piling the excavated earth, was consuming time and energy. She needed to work smarter, not just harder. She repositioned her bucket directly next to the excavation area and changed her technique. Instead of lifting each shovelful high and carrying it, she began moving the dirt in stages. Dig and toss the earth to the side of the hole. When enough accumulated, shovel it into the bucket. When the bucket filled, carry it outside and dump it. The staged approach reduced the number of times she had to lift and carry, conserving energy and increasing her effective digging rate. The improvement was significant. By evening of the first day, she had removed approximately 8 cubic feet of earth, 8 times her midday rate. Her body screamed with fatigue, but the math now suggested the excavation might be possible in 40 to 50 days of hard work, assuming she could maintain this pace. The second day brought new challenges. Her blistered hands had stiffened overnight, the torn skin crusted and painful. Every grip of the shovel handle reopened the wounds. Helena wrapped her hands in cloth torn from an old shirt, creating crude gloves that provided minimal protection but allowed her to continue working. The wrapping soaked through with blood within an hour, but it was enough. She developed a rhythm. Dig for 45 minutes, rest for 15. During rest periods, she drank water and forced herself to eat small amounts of food, maintaining energy levels. The work became meditative in its repetition. Drive the shovel in, leverage it, toss the earth, repeat. The pile of excavated soil outside the cabin grew steadily. On the third day, when she was perhaps 3 feet into the excavation, she struck rock. Not a small stone that could be pried out, but a large boulder embedded in the clay, extending in multiple directions beyond what she could see. Helena spent 2 hours digging around it, exposing its dimensions. The rock was roughly the size of a wash basin, immovable by hand. She needed tools she did not have: a sledgehammer to break the rock, or a pry bar long enough to provide adequate leverage, or help from someone strong enough to assist with moving it. But asking for help would expose the project, and purchasing additional heavy tools would raise questions in town. Helena considered her options and made a decision that would have seemed insane to any observer. She began chipping away at the rock with her pickaxe, striking it repeatedly in the same spot, creating a fracture line. The work was brutally slow. Hours passed with minimal visible progress, but gradually microscopic cracks expanded. The rock's internal structure began to fail. After 6 hours of striking the same point repeatedly, the boulder finally split. Helena was able to remove it in 2 pieces, each requiring all her strength to lift and haul outside. The incident with the rock taught her something important about the project. Every plan would encounter unexpected obstacles. Flexibility and persistence mattered more than perfect preparation. She could not anticipate every problem, but she could refuse to let problems stop her. By the time the 3 days ended and she needed to retrieve her children from the Colemans, Helena had excavated approximately 30 cubic feet of earth. Her hands were destroyed, wrapped in bloody cloth. Her body moved with the stiffness of someone twice her age. But the hole in her cabin floor was visible, real, undeniable progress toward the vision she had committed to paper. She replaced the floorboards carefully, moved the furniture back into position, and went to collect Anna and Thomas. Sarah Coleman commented that Helena looked tired. Helena agreed that sorting through Jacob's belongings had been emotionally exhausting. Sarah offered sympathy and sent them home with fresh bread. The lie held perfectly because it was built on a foundation of truth. Helena was exhausted, just not for the reasons anyone imagined. Summer arrived in Dakota Territory with oppressive heat that turned the excavation into an oven. Helena worked in the early morning hours before the temperature climbed, and again in the evening after the worst heat passed. The middle of the day she devoted to necessary tasks, caring for the children, maintaining the garden, managing the livestock, and maintaining the appearance of normal life. The digging continued through June. Helena sent the children on frequent visits to neighbors, created errands that kept them occupied away from the cabin, and worked with single-minded intensity during every available hour. The excavation deepened steadily. 3 feet became 4, then 5, then 6. The physical toll was extraordinary. Helena's weight dropped. Her hands developed calluses so thick they resembled leather. Her body adapted to the work, becoming leaner and harder, but the exhaustion was constant. By early July, the excavation reached its target depth of 7 feet. Helena stood at the bottom of the hole, looking up at the cabin floor above her, and experienced a moment of profound satisfaction. She had dug out approximately 400 cubic feet of earth, using nothing but determination and basic tools. The impossible had become actual. Now came the technical work that would determine whether the room would be safe or deadly. The walls needed to be stabilized before they could collapse inward. Helena had purchased the necessary timber during multiple trips to town over the previous months, storing it discreetly behind the cabin where it appeared to be materials for general repairs. She began with the corner posts, thick beams 8 inches square and 8 feet long. These would form the structural skeleton of the room. She dug holes at each corner, extending another foot below the excavation floor, and set the posts vertically. The posts needed to be perfectly plumb, truly vertical, or the entire structure would be compromised. Helena used a plumb line, a simple weight on a string, checking and rechecking each post's position before packing earth and stones around its base to hold it in place. Between the corner posts, she installed additional vertical supports every 2 feet around the perimeter. These were slightly smaller timbers, 6 inches square, but still substantial. The framework began to emerge, a skeleton of wood defining the room's dimensions and providing anchor points for everything else. The next phase required solving a problem that had occupied her thoughts for weeks: how to create walls that would resist the immense pressure of surrounding Earth trying to collapse inward. Her solution was a hybrid approach, combining multiple structural principles she had observed in different contexts. She began filling the spaces between vertical timbers with stone, dry stacking rocks she had been collecting for months. The stones came from the excavation itself, from the creek bed, from anywhere she could gather them without drawing attention. She selected each stone carefully, looking for relatively flat surfaces that would stack stably. The work was meticulous and slow. Each stone needed to be positioned to maximize contact with adjacent stones, creating a wall that distributed pressure across hundreds of individual points rather than concentrating stress at a few joints. The stone walls rose gradually, filling the spaces between timbers. Helena worked from bottom to top, ensuring each layer was stable before adding the next. As the walls climbed higher, she incorporated an innovation she had read about in an article describing ancient Roman construction. She drove wooden wedges between stones at strategic points, then soaked the wedges with water. The wood expanded, locking stones together with tremendous force. As the wedges dried, they contracted slightly, but the stones remained locked in their expanded positions, creating a wall that was rigid and self-supporting. Behind the stone walls, Helena left a 4-inch gap before the earthen walls of the excavation. This airspace served multiple purposes. It would help manage moisture, allowing any water that seeped through the earth to drain down rather than soaking into the room's interior. It would provide additional insulation, and it would give the stone walls room to shift slightly if earth pressure increased, preventing catastrophic failure. The ceiling presented the project's greatest engineering challenge. Helena needed to support not just the weight of the cabin's floor structure, but everything on that floor: furniture, stored supplies, and potentially people walking above. The total weight could easily exceed several thousand pounds. A failure here would be immediately fatal to anyone in the room below. She had purchased 6 massive timber beams, each one 12 inches square and 12 feet long. These beams cost more than all her other materials combined, but they were non-negotiable. She could not compromise on the ceiling's strength. Getting the beams into position required mechanical advantage she did not possess through strength alone. Helena constructed a simple lever system using a fulcrum made from stacked stones and a long pole she had shaped from a tree trunk. By positioning the fulcrum correctly and applying force to the pole's long end, she could lift weights far exceeding her own strength. The process was dangerous. If a beam slipped while elevated, it could crush her instantly. She worked with obsessive care, checking every element of her lever system before committing to each lift. The first beam took 3 hours to position. She lifted one end onto the wall, adjusted the lever, lifted the other end, repositioned everything, made tiny adjustments, and finally settled the beam across the room, resting on the stone walls she had built. By the time the beam was secure, Helena was shaking with exhaustion and residual fear from the danger she had navigated. She installed all 6 beams over the course of a week. They spanned the room at 2-foot intervals, creating a grid of structural support that could bear enormous weight. Across the top of the beams, she laid planking, thick boards that she fitted tightly together. The planking created a solid platform that would serve as the base for waterproofing. Waterproofing was critical. Even a small leak could destroy stored food, create mold, or make the room uninhabitable. Helena had purchased tar paper and pine pitch for this purpose. She laid the tar paper across the planking in overlapping sheets, then painted over everything with melted pine pitch that she had boiled down from raw sap. The pitch created a flexible, waterproof membrane that bonded to both the tar paper and the wood beneath. Above the waterproof layer, she would eventually restore the cabin's original floor structure. But before that final step, she needed to complete the room's interior features and install the critical components that would make it functional. The ladder went in first, anchored to the stone floor with iron brackets that Helena had purchased from the blacksmith in town. She had told him she was repairing a damaged loft access, a plausible lie that explained her need for heavy-duty hardware. The ladder was built from oak, each rung mortised into the side rails and pinned with wooden pegs she had whittled herself during evening hours. The finished piece was solid enough to support 3 times her weight, tested thoroughly before she trusted it with her life. The ventilation shaft required precision that made all her previous work seem simple by comparison. Helena had to drill through the ceiling beams she had just installed, then continue up through the cabin's existing floor structure, creating a continuous vertical channel without compromising structural integrity. She used an auger, a hand-cranked drilling tool that cut slowly through wood. The work was exhausting, requiring her to balance on the ladder while applying steady pressure and turning the crank for hours. The shaft emerged in what would appear to be a support post she planned to install in the cabin's interior. Helena had designed the post to be hollow, constructed from 4 boards joined to create a square column. From the outside, it would look like a standard structural element added to reinforce the cabin's aging frame. Inside, it contained the 4-inch square ventilation channel that would keep air circulating to the room below. At the top of the post, Helena drilled a series of angled holes, each one 3/4 of an inch in diameter, arranged in a spiral pattern around the column's circumference. The holes angled downward from exterior to interior, allowing air to enter while preventing rain or snow from falling straight down the shaft. She covered the top of the post with a wooden cap that had shallow grooves carved on its underside, creating channels that would direct any moisture that did enter toward the angled holes and out of the system. Testing the ventilation required a method to confirm air was actually moving through the shaft. Helena burned a small amount of damp grass in the underground room and climbed up to observe. Smoke rose through the shaft and emerged from the angled holes in a steady stream, dissipating into the cabin's interior air. The system worked. She could breathe underground without slowly suffocating. The trapdoor demanded engineering sophistication that pushed Helena's skills to their limit. The door itself was constructed from tongue and groove planking, identical to the cabin's floor, so when closed, it would be indistinguishable from the surrounding surface. She built it in sections, fitting each plank carefully, then reinforcing the underside with 3 heavy cross braces made from oak. The hinges were massive iron pieces, each one weighing nearly 10 pounds. Helena had paid a premium for them, ordering them specially from a catalog the general store maintained. They arrived 6 weeks after she placed the order, shipped from a foundry in Chicago. She mortised them into both the trapdoor and the floor frame, using the same technique she had observed on heavy warehouse doors in towns she had visited. The mortises distributed stress across a larger area than surface-mounted hinges, making the assembly stronger and less prone to failure. The closing mechanism was Helena's own invention, born from necessity and limited resources. She could not buy a lock strong enough for her purposes, and even if such locks existed, installing one would make the trapdoor obvious. Instead, she created a system of wooden bars that slid through iron brackets mounted on the trapdoor's underside. When engaged from below, the bars extended into mortises cut into the surrounding floor frame, effectively making the door part of the floor structure. To open the door from below required sliding the bars back. To open it from above required knowing exactly where to press on specific floorboards to release the mechanism. She tested the door repeatedly, opening and closing it dozens of times, checking for any binding or misalignment. When closed and properly secured, the trapdoor was invisible. The tongue and groove construction eliminated visible seams. The iron hinges were completely hidden in their mortises. Even knowing where to look, Helena had difficulty identifying the door's location when it was closed, and furniture was positioned above it. The floor of the underground room required attention to drainage. Helena had sloped it slightly, a drop of approximately 3 inches from the high side to the low side, where she installed a small drain. The drain was simple, a clay pipe that angled down and away from the room, leading to a dry well she had dug outside the cabin's foundation. Any water that seeped in would flow to the drain rather than pooling, keeping the room habitable even in wet conditions. She paved the floor with flat stones, selecting the smoothest ones she had collected, fitting them together like a puzzle. The result was not beautiful, but it was functional and would remain stable under the weight of stored supplies. Shelving came next, built directly into the stone walls using brackets driven into gaps between stones. The shelves were narrow but sturdy, designed to hold supplies efficiently while maximizing floor space. Helena built them at varying heights, creating storage zones for different types of goods. Upper shelves for lighter items like dried goods and medicines. Lower shelves for heavier items like water barrels and preserved foods. September arrived with the first hints of autumn in the air, and Helena's construction phase was complete. The underground room existed, functional and hidden, waiting to be filled with the supplies that would justify its existence. She stood at the bottom of the ladder in the dim light from her oil lamp and assessed what she had built. 8 feet by 10 feet of protected space, stone walls that would not collapse, a ceiling that would support the world above, ventilation that would keep air fresh, a trapdoor that was both invisible and secure. Now came the task of transforming an empty room into a survival sanctuary. Helena had been accumulating supplies since summer, hiding purchases among regular household shopping, spreading acquisitions across months to avoid drawing attention. But systematic stocking required organization and planning that went beyond simple accumulation. Water was the first priority. Helena purchased 3 oak barrels, each capable of holding 30 gallons. She told the cooper she needed them for storing preserves, a reasonable explanation that drew no questions. The barrels arrived empty, and Helena spent 2 days filling them using buckets hauled from the well. 90 gallons of water, weighing approximately 720 pounds total, positioned carefully against the stone wall where the floor was strongest. Water storage presented a technical challenge Helena had anticipated during her planning. Stored water could become contaminated with bacteria or develop algae growth, making it unsafe to drink. She addressed this by adding a small amount of whiskey to each barrel, approximately 1 cup per 30 gallons. The alcohol would inhibit bacterial growth without making the water unpalatable. She also covered each barrel tightly with wooden lids she had made to fit precisely, preventing dust and insects from entering. Food stocking required balancing nutrition, preservation, and space efficiency. Helena purchased salted pork in quantity, 50 pounds wrapped in cloth and packed in wooden crates, dried beans, 20 pounds in sealed containers, flour, 40 pounds divided among multiple smaller containers to prevent total loss if one container developed moisture or vermin problems. Hardtack, the dense unleavened bread that could last for years, 30 pounds purchased from the general store's military surplus supplier. Dried apples and other preserved fruits, 15 pounds. Canned vegetables, a luxury but worth the expense. 24 cans purchased over multiple shopping trips. She organized the food supplies on her shelves according to a system she had designed. Most frequently needed items at eye level for easy access. Heavy items on lower shelves to maintain center of gravity. Items that might spoil first positioned for easy inspection and rotation. Everything labeled with contents and date of storage using paper tags attached with string. Medical supplies occupied one entire shelf. Bandages made from boiled cloth cut into strips. A bottle of carbolic acid for disinfection. Laudanum for pain management. Castor oil for digestive problems. Willow bark tea for fever. A surgical needle and thread for suturing wounds. Scissors and tweezers. Helena had learned basic medical care from necessity on the frontier, and she stocked supplies that would allow her to treat common injuries and illnesses without outside help. Lighting and heating required careful consideration. Open flames underground posed obvious dangers, both from consuming oxygen and from producing smoke that could become deadly in an enclosed space. Helena's solution was to stock multiple types of lighting with different risk profiles. Oil lamps for general use when the ventilation shaft was functioning properly. Candles as backup. A small alcohol lamp that burned with minimal smoke for emergency heating or cooking. She stored firewood, but only a limited quantity. Perhaps 20 pieces of split logs, enough for a few small fires if absolutely necessary, but not enough to rely on as a primary heat source. The real heating solution would be wool blankets, and Helena had been collecting them since spring. 12 heavy blankets, purchased from various sources, washed and dried thoroughly, stored in a wooden chest to protect them from moisture. Clothing appropriate for extreme cold came next. Extra undergarments for all 3 of them. Heavy socks, wool pants, thick shirts. A change of clothes for each person in case their daily clothing became wet. Everything folded and stored in another wooden chest with cedar shavings to discourage insects. Tools and equipment filled the remaining storage space. A small hatchet for splitting kindling. A knife for food preparation. Eating utensils, tin plates and cups, basic but functional. A bucket for waste management, grim but necessary. Rope, 50 feet of it, useful for dozens of potential purposes. Matches in a waterproof container. A whetstone for keeping blades sharp. Needles and thread for repairs. A small mirror for medical examinations, or signaling if needed. Books occupied a small but important portion of the supplies. Helena included her Bible, not just for spiritual comfort, but because its familiar passages would provide mental occupation during long periods of confinement. She added 2 children's books for Anna and Thomas, stories they knew well enough to read repeatedly without boredom. A farming almanac for its practical information. A medical guide she had purchased from a traveling salesman the previous year. The final category of supplies was the most emotionally difficult to stock. Helena included a few personal items that connected her family to their normal life. A photograph of Jacob, the only one they owned. A small toy horse that had been Thomas's favorite. A hair ribbon that Anna treasured. These items served no survival function, but Helena understood that morale and mental state would be as important as physical supplies during extended confinement. By late September, the stocking was complete. Helena had invested nearly $200 in supplies beyond the construction costs, money that represented a significant fraction of their remaining savings. The underground room now contained everything her family would need to survive for 30 days without access to the outside world. Food, water, warmth, light, medical care, and even a few small comforts that might make the difference between endurance and psychological collapse. The latter went in first, anchored to the stone floor with iron brackets that Helena had purchased from the blacksmith in town. She had told him she was repairing a damaged loft access, a plausible lie that explained her need for heavy-duty hardware. The ladder was built from oak, each rung mortised into the side rails and pinned with wooden pegs she had whittled herself during evening hours. The ventilation shaft required precision that made all her previous work seem simple by comparison. Helena had to drill through the ceiling beams she had just installed, then continue up through the cabin's existing floor structure, creating a continuous vertical channel without compromising structural integrity. The shaft emerged in what would appear to be a support post she planned to install in the cabin's interior. Helena had designed the post to be hollow, constructed from 4 boards joined to create a square column. From the outside, it would look like a standard structural element. Inside, it contained the 4-inch square ventilation channel that would keep air circulating to the room below. The trapdoor demanded engineering sophistication that pushed Helena's skills to their limit. The door itself was constructed from tongue and groove planking, identical to the cabin's floor, so when closed, it would be indistinguishable from the surrounding surface. The hinges were massive iron pieces, each one weighing nearly 10 pounds. She mortised them into both the trapdoor and the floor frame, distributing stress across a larger area than surface-mounted hinges. When closed and properly secured, the trapdoor was invisible. September arrived with the first hints of autumn in the air, and Helena's construction phase was complete. The underground room existed, functional and hidden, waiting to be filled with the supplies that would justify its existence. Now came the task of transforming an empty room into a survival sanctuary. Water was the first priority. Helena purchased 3 oak barrels, each capable of holding 30 gallons. She told the cooper she needed them for storing preserves, a reasonable explanation that drew no questions. 90 gallons of water, weighing approximately 720 pounds total, positioned carefully against the stone wall where the floor was strongest. Food stocking required balancing nutrition, preservation, and space efficiency. Helena purchased salted pork, 50 pounds wrapped in cloth. Dried beans, 20 pounds in sealed containers. Flour, 40 pounds divided among multiple smaller containers. Hardtack, 30 pounds purchased from the general store's military surplus supplier. Dried apples and other preserved fruits, 15 pounds. Canned vegetables, 24 cans purchased over multiple shopping trips. Medical supplies occupied one entire shelf: bandages, carbolic acid for disinfection, laudanum for pain management, willow bark tea for fever, surgical needle and thread. Lighting came from oil lamps and candles. Heating would rely on wool blankets, 12 heavy ones purchased from various sources. By late September, the stocking was complete. The underground room now contained everything her family would need to survive for 30 days. The first Saturday of October brought the quarterly social gathering at the church in town, an event that drew homesteading families from 20 miles in every direction. Helena attended with Anna and Thomas, wearing their best clothes, carrying a basket of bread she had baked the previous day. The gathering served multiple purposes beyond worship. It was where news spread, where business was conducted informally, where the scattered community maintained social bonds that made frontier isolation bearable. Helena knew she would be discussed. The unusual purchases, the time spent alone at her cabin, the physical changes in her appearance that suggested hard labor, all of it had been noticed. The women gathered in small clusters after the service. Helena stood near the food tables when she heard her name spoken behind her. "She spent Jacob's money on mining equipment and building materials," Margaret Thornton said to a group of women. "Sarah Coleman told me Helena sent the children away for days at a time this summer." "I saw her buying barrels," Ruth Anders added. 3 of them, and rope, lamp oil, enough supplies for a military expedition. "The woman is building a tomb," Elizabeth Patterson said. "I've seen the pile of dirt behind her cabin." Helena turned to face them directly. "I've been reinforcing my cabin's foundation. The structure was settling badly, nothing mysterious." But she could feel eyes following her for the rest of the gathering. The community had rendered its verdict. She was unstable, wasteful, unable to manage her grief appropriately. Helena waited until late October to reveal the underground room to Anna and Thomas. She chose a Sunday afternoon when the weather was mild and the children were in good spirits. She had been preparing them indirectly for weeks, telling stories about pioneers who survived disasters through careful preparation. "I want to show you something important," Helena said, moving the table aside and rolling up the rug that covered the trapdoor. "Something I've been building to keep us safe." Thomas watched with wide eyes as his mother pressed specific points on the floorboards. The hidden latch released. Helena lifted the trapdoor, revealing the ladder descending into darkness below. "It's a secret room," she said. "A place where we can go if we need to hide or stay safe during bad weather." Helena descended with an oil lamp. The children followed, Anna moving carefully, Thomas with fearless enthusiasm. They reached the bottom and looked around with wonder. "You built this, Mama?" Anna asked. "I did, over the summer. It took a long time, but I wanted us to have a place where we'd be safe, no matter what happened outside." She spent the next hour teaching them the room's features: how to climb the ladder safely, where supplies were stored, how to close and secure the trapdoor from below. They practiced until the motions became automatic. "This room is our family's secret," Helena said. "We don't tell neighbors. We don't tell friends. Do you understand?" Both children nodded. They understood secrets. This one was simply larger than most. January of 1888 brought normal cold to Dakota Territory, nothing unusual for the season. Temperatures dropped below 0 at night, but climbed to reasonable levels during daylight hours. Snow fell in predictable patterns, accumulating gradually but not catastrophically. Community life continued with the rhythm familiar to frontier families. Neighbors visited when weather permitted. Men tended livestock and cut firewood. Women managed households and preserved what food remained from autumn harvests. Helena's underground room became a source of quiet comfort rather than active concern. She checked the supplies weekly, rotating stock to ensure nothing spoiled, verifying that the ventilation shaft remained clear of ice. The room had faded from immediate worry to background preparation, like fire buckets kept filled or axes sharpened against need. Anna and Thomas occasionally asked about the secret room, usually during evening hours when the family gathered near the fireplace. Helena would remind them of the procedures, quiz them gently on what to do in various situations. The children treated these conversations as games, reciting memorized steps without fully grasping their importance. By early February, the winter seemed likely to pass without significant incident. Other families had experienced the usual hardships: frozen water supplies, illness, minor injuries from cold weather work, but nothing catastrophic. Helena began to wonder if her preparations had been excessive, if the room she had spent months building would never serve its intended purpose. February 8th brought the first sign that her assumptions were wrong. The sky changed color during the afternoon, shifting from winter blue to a peculiar greenish gray that Helena had never seen before. The air pressure dropped, creating a sensation in her ears like descending a steep hill. Birds disappeared from the trees around the cabin. The family's horse became agitated in its shelter, stamping and whinnying without apparent cause. Helena stood outside in the strange light, watching clouds build on the northwestern horizon. They moved with unnatural speed, piling into formations that looked more like ocean waves than weather. The temperature had been near zero that morning. By late afternoon, it was climbing, reaching almost 20 degrees, a sudden warming that felt wrong for the season. Thomas came outside and stood next to his mother. "The sky looks sick," he said. Helena agreed. The sky looked exactly like that, as if the atmosphere itself had contracted an illness. She put her hand on her son's shoulder and guided him back inside. February 9th, 1888, began with Helena waking before dawn to a sound she had never heard before. It was not wind exactly, though wind was part of it. It was a roar, a physical presence of noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. She rose from her bed and went to the window. She could see nothing outside. Not darkness, but a white chaos so complete that the world beyond the glass had ceased to exist. The temperature had fallen dramatically overnight. Helena could feel cold radiating from the walls despite the fire she had banked in the fireplace before sleeping. She added wood and stirred the coals, building up heat quickly. Anna and Thomas were still asleep in the loft. Helena let them rest while she assessed the situation. This was not a normal storm. She had lived through Dakota winters long enough to recognize the difference between harsh weather and catastrophic disaster. The wind was strong enough that she could feel the cabin structure flexing slightly, beams creaking under pressure. Snow was not falling so much as being driven horizontally at velocities that made it a weapon. Within an hour of waking, Helena made her decision. The cabin would not be safe. Whether from cold, structural failure, or simple inability to maintain heat against the wind's assault, staying in the main living space would eventually become fatal. They needed to go underground immediately, before conditions worsened, before movement between the cabin and the hidden room became impossible. She woke the children gently. "We're going to practice the emergency drill," she said, keeping her voice calm. "Just like we talked about, we're going to the safe room." Anna's eyes went wide with understanding. Thomas looked confused, but compliant. Helena dressed them both in every warm garment they owned, layer upon layer until they could barely move their arms. She filled a basket with additional supplies from the cabin, items she had not pre-stocked below. Extra blankets, her Bible, a few toys for the children. She opened the trap door and sent the children down first. Anna descended smoothly, her practice paying off. Thomas followed, moving slowly under the bulk of his clothing. Helena took one last look at the cabin interior, grabbed the basket, and climbed down after them. From below, she pulled the trapdoor closed and secured it with the wooden bars, sliding them into their mortises with practiced efficiency. The sound of the wind diminished immediately, muffled by the layers of wood and earth between them and the storm. The underground room was cold, but nowhere near the lethal temperatures developing above. Helena lit an oil lamp. The warm light filled their stone sanctuary. She looked at her children's faces, saw the fear there mixed with trust, and felt a wave of gratitude that she had built this impossible room. They were safe. Whatever happened above, down here, they would survive. Life in the hidden room established its own rhythm within hours of descending. Helena rationed their lamp oil carefully, lighting it only for meals and necessary tasks, letting darkness fill the hours between. The children adapted with surprising resilience. Thomas treated the confinement as an extended camping adventure. Anna understood the gravity but followed her mother's lead, remaining calm and helpful. Helena calculated their supplies obsessively. Water consumption was critical. She allowed each person 1 cup for drinking 3 times daily, plus minimal amounts for washing hands and faces. The 3 barrels would last 30 days at this rate, possibly longer if they became more stringent. Food came from the carefully organized shelves, hardtack and dried fruit for breakfast, beans soaked in water and eaten cold for midday meals, salted pork and preserved vegetables for evening dinners. The ventilation shaft worked perfectly. Fresh air circulated constantly, preventing the stuffiness that could have made the space unbearable. Helena checked the shaft multiple times daily, feeling the flow of air, confirming that snow had not blocked the opening above. Temperature underground remained stable, cold enough to require blankets, but far warmer than the lethal conditions she knew existed in the cabin above. They huddled together under wool blankets during rest periods, body heat creating a microclimate of survivable warmth. Thomas asked frequently when they could go back upstairs. Helena told him they needed to wait until the storm passed, that she would know when it was safe. She did not tell him that she had no idea how long that would be, that storms of this magnitude had no precedent in her experience. Anna helped manage her brother, reading to him from their small collection of books, playing quiet games that required no space or materials. The girl's maturity showed in every action. She rationed her own food without being asked. She whispered instead of talking loudly. She understood intuitively that survival required discipline. Days blurred together in the underground darkness. Helena marked time by meals and sleep cycles, scratching marks on a wooden beam to track their confinement. Day 1, Day 2, Day 3. Above them, the storm continued its assault. They could hear it faintly through the layers of protection, a distant roar that never stopped. Helena wondered how the cabin was faring, whether it still stood, whether the trapdoor remained accessible or had been buried under collapsed debris. On Day 4, Thomas developed a cough. Helena's heart seized with fear. Illness in this confined space could spread rapidly, and she had limited medical supplies. She gave him willow bark tea and extra blankets, monitoring his temperature anxiously. The cough persisted but did not worsen. By day 5, it had diminished to occasional clearing of his throat. The psychological challenge grew with each passing day. Confinement wore on all of them. The children became restless, their quiet games giving way to irritability and small arguments. Helena mediated constantly, maintaining peace in their tiny sanctuary. She told stories, recited Bible passages from memory, sang songs her own mother had taught her. Anything to occupy minds that threatened to turn against their circumstances. Day 5 began like the previous 4, with Helena waking in darkness and lighting the lamp to prepare breakfast. She was rationing their hardtack when the sound came from above. It was not the steady roar of wind they had grown accustomed to, but something different. A cracking noise, sharp and distinct, followed by a tremendous crash that shook the underground room. Dust fell from the ceiling beams. The lamp flame flickered but stayed lit. Helena grabbed both children instinctively, pulling them close. Thomas began crying. Anna remained silent but gripped her mother's arm with fingers that dug in hard enough to hurt. The sound continued for several seconds. More cracking, shifting, settling. Then silence except for the ever-present wind. Helena waited, counting her heartbeats, expecting the ceiling to collapse, expecting tons of debris to crush them. But the timber beams held. The stone walls remained solid. The carefully engineered structure she had built absorbed the impact and distributed the forces safely. After 5 minutes of terrifying stillness, Helena released the children and stood up. She examined the ceiling carefully by lamplight. The beams showed no signs of stress. The waterproofing remained intact. Whatever had happened above, her underground room had survived it. "What was that?" Anna whispered. "Part of the cabin collapsed," Helena said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "The snow was too heavy for the roof, but we're safe down here. The room is strong." She did not say what she was thinking. If they had stayed in the cabin, as most families would have, that collapse would have killed them. The weight of snow and timber falling from above would have crushed anyone in the main living space. Her decision to come underground immediately before the storm's full fury developed had saved their lives. Thomas stopped crying and looked up at the ceiling with wide eyes. "Can we go back up?" "Not yet, sweetheart. We need to wait longer." Helena climbed the ladder and examined the trap door from below. She could hear debris on top of it, weight pressing down, but the door's engineering held firm. The reinforced construction and the way she had integrated it into the floor structure meant it functioned as part of the ceiling now, bearing load without failing. She could not open it yet, not with debris piled above, but she had confidence it would remain intact. She descended and gathered the children again. "We're going to be down here longer than I thought," she said carefully. "The cabin is damaged, but we have plenty of supplies. We're warm and safe. We just need to be patient." Anna processed this information with visible concern. "How long?" "I don't know. Days, maybe. But we can do this. We're prepared." The collapse changed the psychological dynamics of their confinement. Before, the underground room had felt temporary, a shelter they would leave when conditions improved. Now it felt like their only world. The cabin above, if it still existed in any functional form, was inaccessible. They were committed to this space until the storm ended and rescue came, or until Helena could dig them out. She recalculated their supplies with this new timeline. 30 days of provisions meant they could survive into early March if necessary. Water was the limiting factor. Food could be stretched further through stricter rationing, but water consumption could only be reduced so much before dehydration became dangerous. Helena made the decision not to share these calculations with the children. They needed to believe rescue was imminent, that their confinement would end soon. Hope was as important as food for survival. She would carry the burden of knowing how precarious their situation truly was. That was what mothers did. They carried the weight so their children could remain light. Days 6 through 18 became a blur of routine and endurance. Helena marked each day on her wooden beam, scratching lines that represented time passing in the darkness. The children's spirits fluctuated wildly. Some days Thomas sang songs and played imaginary games. Other days he lay silent under blankets, withdrawn into himself. Anna tried to maintain composure, but Helena saw the strain in her daughter's face, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was watching. Food rationing became stricter. Helena reduced portions gradually, hoping the children would not notice the shrinking meals. She gave them larger shares and took less for herself, lying when they asked if she had eaten. Hunger became a constant companion, gnawing but manageable. Thirst was worse. The water barrels were depleting faster than Helena had hoped. Her calculations showed they might run out by day 25 if consumption continued at current rates. The air remained breathable thanks to the ventilation shaft. Helena checked it obsessively, feeling for the flow of fresh air that meant the opening above remained clear. On day 12, the airflow seemed weaker. She spent an hour in near panic before determining that ice had partially blocked the shaft. She could do nothing about it from below, but fortunately the blockage was incomplete. Enough air still circulated to sustain them. Helena told stories to pass the time. She recounted her own childhood in Kentucky, invented elaborate tales about animals and adventures, recited every Bible story she could remember. Thomas particularly loved the story of Noah's Ark, finding comfort in the parallel of a family surviving catastrophe by staying in a protected space while destruction raged outside. On day 15, Anna asked the question Helena had been dreading. "Mama, what if the storm never stops?" Helena pulled her daughter close. "All storms stop eventually. This one will too. We just have to be patient and trust our preparations." "What if nobody finds us?" "They will. Our neighbors know we're here. When the storm ends, people will check on each other. That's what communities do." Helena did not voice her darker thoughts. What if their neighbors had died in the storm? What if every cabin within miles had collapsed? What if they were the only survivors in a landscape of frozen death? The questions circled in her mind during dark hours when the children slept and she lay awake counting their remaining supplies. The lamp oil was running low. Helena began lighting it only for meals, stretching their illumination as far as possible. Darkness filled most hours now. They learned to navigate the small space by touch and memory. Thomas bumped into walls less frequently. Anna moved with confidence, even when she could not see. They were adapting, becoming creatures of the underground. On day 18, Helena noticed the wind sound had changed. It was still present, but less aggressive, less constant. The roar that had filled every moment since they descended now came in waves rather than as a continuous assault. She said nothing to the children, not wanting to raise hopes prematurely, but she allowed herself to think that perhaps the worst was passing. Perhaps survival was becoming more than a desperate hope. Day 21 brought silence. Helena woke in darkness and realized she could not hear the wind. She lay still, listening intently, wondering if her ears were deceiving her after weeks of constant noise. But the silence was real and profound. Above them, the storm had finally stopped. She lit their precious remaining lamp oil and climbed the ladder. At the trap door, she pressed her ear against the wood and listened. Nothing. She tested the locking bars, sliding them back carefully. The door was heavy, weighted down by debris, but not impossibly so. She braced her feet on the ladder and pushed upward with her shoulders. The trap door lifted an inch, 2 inches. Cold air rushed in, shockingly frigid compared to the underground room's stable temperature. Helena pushed harder. The door opened enough for her to see outside. Gray daylight filtered through gaps in what remained of the cabin's roof. Snow had drifted inside, covering everything. The cabin's interior was destroyed, walls standing, but the roof largely collapsed, furniture buried under snow and broken timber. She lowered the trapdoor and descended. Anna and Thomas watched her with desperate hope in their faces. "The storm stopped," Helena said, "but the cabin is badly damaged. We need to wait a bit longer before we go up. Let me check if it's safe." She waited an hour, listening for any sounds of continuing wind or structural collapse. The silence held. The temperature was rising slightly. She could feel it through the ventilation shaft. The blizzard was breaking. Helena made the decision. They would emerge. She dressed the children in their warmest clothes, layering everything they had. She gathered what remained of their food supplies in case they needed to travel to a neighbor's home. Then she climbed the ladder and pushed the trapdoor open fully. The scene above was devastation. Snow had drifted to depths of 5 and 6 feet in places. The cabin's roof was gone, beams snapped under impossible weight. What remained of their furniture was crushed or buried. But the trapdoor had held. The underground room had protected them perfectly. Helena helped the children up the ladder. They stood in the ruins of their home, squinting against daylight they had not seen in 3 weeks. The world outside was transformed, buried under snow that stretched in every direction like an alien landscape. Thomas pointed toward the horizon. "Mama, look at the neighbors!" Helena turned and felt her heart sink. Smoke, the sign of inhabited homes with fires burning, was absent. No chimneys produced the telltale trails that meant families were alive and warm inside. The landscape was silent and smokeless. She counted the directions where neighboring homesteads should be visible. 7 families lived within sight on clear days. Not a single column of smoke rose from any direction. "We need to check on people," Helena said quietly. "Some families might need help." She knew as she said it that help might come too late. The underground room had saved her family, but how many others had died in cabins that could not withstand the storm's fury? Rescue parties formed slowly over the following days as survivors emerged and discovered the magnitude of the disaster. Helena and her children walked to the Coleman homestead first, trudging through snow that reached Thomas's waist. They found the cabin collapsed, the roof caved in completely. Sarah Coleman and her husband were dead, frozen in what remained of their home. Helena shielded the children from seeing the bodies, but she could not shield them from understanding what had happened. The pattern repeated at homestead after homestead. The Thorntons had survived, barely, by huddling in a corner where part of their roof remained intact. Margaret Thornton was frostbitten badly, unlikely to keep all her fingers. The Anders family was gone, all 4 of them. their cabin a tomb of snow and broken timber. The Pattersons had lost their youngest child, a boy of 3 who had frozen despite his parents' desperate attempts to keep him warm. 15 people in the surrounding area had died. 4 were children. The survivors spoke of the storm with voices hollow from trauma and disbelief. No one had experienced anything like it. The cold had been beyond comprehension, temperatures reaching 40 degrees below zero, with wind that made exposure instantly fatal. Cabins that had stood for years had collapsed under snow weight. Food supplies had run out. Firewood had been consumed desperately trying to maintain heat. Families had died not from sudden disaster, but from slow attrition, cold creeping in hour by hour until it stole consciousness and then life. When people learned that Helena and her children had survived unharmed, that they had weathered the entire storm in comfort and safety, the questions began. How had they managed it? How had their cabin protected them when others had failed? Helena led a group of neighbors back to her destroyed home and showed them the trap door. She explained what she had built over the summer, the underground room she had stocked with supplies, the sanctuary that had kept her family alive through 3 weeks of the worst storm in Dakota Territory history. The reaction was complex. Amazement mixed with guilt and grief. If they had known, if Helena had shared her plans, if they had not mocked her preparations, might some of the dead still be alive? Margaret Thornton, standing with bandaged hands, began crying. Not from pain, but from the realization that her ridicule might have prevented others from taking similar precautions. "You tried to tell us," Margaret said through tears. "Not directly, but you showed us by your actions. We called you mad. We said you were wasting Jacob's money. We were so sure we knew better." Helena had no words of comfort that would not sound like condemnation. She had not built the room to prove anything to her neighbors. She had built it to save her children. But the contrast between her family's survival and the deaths of others created a moral weight that was impossible to ignore. Over the following weeks, as spring began its slow arrival and the snow gradually melted, the survivors began building again. But this time, several families incorporated underground rooms into their reconstruction plans. They came to Helena asking for guidance on excavation depth, wall construction, ventilation systems. She shared everything she knew, drawing diagrams, explaining techniques, helping families create their own survival sanctuaries. The community that had mocked the widow's folly now praised the widow's wisdom. But the praise felt hollow to Helena. She had not wanted to be proven right at such terrible cost. She had simply wanted her children to live. Spring of 1888 brought renewal to Dakota Territory, but the scars of the Great Blizzard remained visible everywhere. Empty homesteads marked where families had died or abandoned their claims. New construction rose slowly as survivors rebuilt with harder wisdom. And beneath many of those new structures, underground rooms took shape, modeled after the sanctuary Helena Marsh had built. Helena's children grew up carrying the memory of 3 weeks underground, of their mother's preparation that had saved them when conventional wisdom failed. Anna would tell the story to her own children decades later, describing how her mother had dug with bleeding hands through summer heat to create a space that became their salvation in winter's fury. Thomas would become a builder himself, incorporating underground shelters into homes he constructed, spreading the principle that true safety required thinking beyond tradition. The room beneath Helena's rebuilt cabin remained functional for 30 years. She maintained the supplies, rotated the stock, kept the ladder solid and the ventilation clear. The room was never needed again for its original purpose. No storm in her lifetime matched the fury of February 1888. But the room's existence provided something beyond physical protection. It provided peace of mind, the knowledge that catastrophe could be survived through preparation and foresight. Helena died in 1920 at the age of 63, surrounded by her adult children and grandchildren. She was buried next to Jacob in the small cemetery outside town. Her gravestone bore simple words chosen by Anna. She knew. The phrase captured everything essential about Helena's life. She had known that conventional preparations were inadequate. She had known that disasters exceeded most people's planning. She had known that survival required doing what others considered excessive or mad. And she had acted on that knowledge despite mockery, despite exhaustion, despite the enormous cost in time and resources. The underground room she built became a symbol across Dakota Territory and beyond. Stories spread of the widow who had dug a sanctuary that saved her children. The tale was embellished in some retellings, simplified in others, but the core truth remained. One woman's refusal to accept conventional wisdom had created something that survived when everything traditional failed. By the 1930s, when the Dust Bowl brought new disasters to the plains, the descendants of those who had survived the Great Blizzard were building storm shelters and root cellars with the same obsessive care Helena had demonstrated. The specific threat had changed from blizzards to dust storms and tornadoes, but the principle remained constant. Protection required preparation. Survival required building what others might not understand until crisis proved its necessity. Modern historians studying frontier architecture often reference the Marsh underground room as an example of innovative crisis response. Engineering students examine the structural principles Helena employed, techniques she derived from observation and necessity rather than formal training. The room itself, preserved as part of a homestead museum, stands as physical evidence of what determination and foresight could accomplish with limited resources. But perhaps the most important legacy was simpler and more human. Helena Marsh proved that love could manifest as preparation, that a mother's care could take the form of months digging in darkness, that protection of children could require doing what seemed insane to ensure they would live when disaster came. The neighbors had mocked the widow's secret room. They had called it foolishness, waste, evidence of grief-addled judgment. But when the blizzard came and 3 weeks of killing cold tested every family's preparations, only Helena's children emerged unharmed. The mocked had become the model. The folly had become wisdom. And the impossible room that should not have worked had proven to be exactly what was needed when everything else failed.